Hi everybody, my name's Tobias McCorkell and I'm an author and I've written the book Everything in Its Right Place. So this is my book, published by Transit Lounge. Came out in October 2020. The story follows Ford McCullen, who's growing up with his mother and grandparents in a house in Coburg. And it's a coming-of-age story set in the last 2 years of high school, following his journey across the river to a all-boys private school in Toorak, and also to country Victoria, where he spends his weekends with his father. Basically, the story is of family history and dealing with trauma, coming of age, identity, but also social class and sexuality and mental health as well. This is my first book. This is my debut novel. Am I a full-time writer? No, nobody's a full-time writer. Yeah. I started working on a book when I was 18. And I've written fiction in the background for the last 14 years or so. But I was working at Melbourne University. I was teaching in the creative writing faculty there for many years. So it's not the first novel I've written, but it's the first one to get published. I had a novel win an unpublished manuscript award back in 2015, but no, that book hasn't seen the light of day yet. That's a pretty big question. Why do I write? I mean, I think on the personal level, it's to process aspects of my life and my own thoughts and ideas. I think that fiction writing is sort of, in some ways, philosophical, I think. I think it's about, how you see the world and how you are, processing what's going on around you. But also there's the other side of it, which is the artistic side and wanting to, express yourself. Part of the writing that I do, I think, has always been to kind of document the world around me. And that's why I wanted to write a local book. The novel's predominantly set in Coburg, which is where I grew up, actually. And I quite like that idea of documenting the times, taking measure of what's out there culturally, people, society. But I mean, I think it's really just a deeply personal thing as well. It's always difficult to answer that question. How do I write? Well, I write by hand. So all my drafts are longhand. In terms of how this book was produced, I spent a couple of years working on what I thought was going to be a non-fiction book. But ultimately, I never really wanted to write non-fiction. I've always wanted to write novels. I just think that they have a certain quality that is that's different to other kinds of writing. So I spent a couple of years doing some research and working on notes and various things. But when it came time to writing this as a novel, it was actually a pretty quick process. It was done in about 16 weeks. I got up every day and would write 500 to 1,000 words a day over 16 weeks. And first thing in the morning, and then in the evening, type what I've written by hand. And that process is kind of like an inbuilt editing process, because when you type, you don't type exactly what you wrote. You sort of edit as you go. So it ensures that you're revising as you move along. And once I have that typed manuscript, that's when the real work starts. That's when the editing starts and the revisions and all that sort of thing. So that's my process generally when working on a book. Writing in 2020 was stressful. Everything in 2020 was stressful. I think that initially, I mean, everybody was terribly optimistic about this lockdown time, that we would have all this time on our hands and suddenly be massively productive, which of course didn't happen at all. I think people just kind of, got depressed, really, which is a fair response. And my writing in 2020, I mean, I have been, as I say, I've just finished a new novel, actually, which I sent to my agent a week ago. But so I worked on that a little bit, and I was under contract for another book, which was an academic thing, which I failed to produce. So, not so good. And so I've been reading a lot of books, which has been fun, because when you write, you don't always get to read as much as you'd like. Yeah. Currently, I'm reading all of Patricia Highsmith's novels, the Tom Ripley books, which I'm loving. But in terms of recommendations, somebody who's published by Transit Lounge as well, Roger Averill, who actually wrote a really lovely endorsement for my novel, he has a book out called... I've totally forgotten the name of it. Called Relatively Famous. Roger Averill's book, Relatively Famous, which was published in 2019. I do recommend that. That's set in Brunswick, and it follows the life of the son of a famous author who is processing his father's life and dealing with a biographer who's come into his life, who's writing about his father. So there were lots of themes in that book, very different to my book, of course, but there was a little bit of shared overlap in terms of fathers and sons and masculinity and local setting and all that sort of stuff. It didn't get enough press in 2019. And it wasn't reviewed widely, which is always one of these tricky things. If a book isn't reviewed, you're kind of you're doomed a little bit. I really enjoyed Polly by Paul Delgado, and Paul's also a local writer. He lives in Coburg as well, like me, and we have the same agent, so I've got to recommend Paul's book. I guess I remember Clifford, Big Red Dog, and I think the YA series, Tomorrow When the War Began, which my grandmother has reminded me of. I wasn't a particularly advanced reader, or I wasn't dazzling anybody with my, I mean, look, yeah, I was a pretty typical kid. I was more interested in sports than reading, really. And it wasn't until sort of those teen years when I started sort of developing a bit of a sense of myself that reading became more important. So I have distinct memories of, there's two phases to my reading. Was that when I was about 15 or so, I remember it being year 9, the two books that were majorly influential in my life were Lolita and The Virgin Suicides by Jeffrey Eugenides. So two books that were kind of strangely, depressingly erotic, while also psychologically off, which said something about my sensibility at the time, I guess. But I was also reading, I was getting into that teenage mindset of becoming attracted to existentialism, basically, and reading a lot of Albert Camus. But Lolita and Virgin Suicides and The Stranger, the Camus book, as well as The Plague, those novels were really important to me. And I think that that's when I started seeing an overlap between fiction writing and philosophy, which is what I mentioned before. And I started to see how, like, a world perspective could be translated or gotten across to an audience in fiction. And so I started to see the power of it, I guess. But in terms of books that got me writing, that was after I left school, and that was Bret Easton Ellis reading Lesson Zero and The Rules of Attraction, and then also Christos Tsiolkas and Helen Garner reading Monkey Grip and Loaded, which was so important for me. It was a book where I could see, you can set a novel in Melbourne, you can set it in the north, and you can use what's around you and put that into your work. So that was when it went from me enjoying books to I want to do this. I want to write a book. But I have actually coming out in May this year a collection of personal essays on social class in Australia, which is coming out through Scribe. Which collects about 14 writers. In terms of writing, there's a number of projects that are on the go. I've just finished a novel, but at the same time, I have this inkling that it's not the only book in that it might become a series, which no publisher or agent wants to know about. It's very unattractive to be writing a series, let alone a literary series. Of books set in Melbourne. It's probably not, the major selling point. But that's what I'd like to work on. I'd like to do another one of those, which is following this young author and basically like his dating life, but also his family and navigating all of that. I've got an idea for some non-fiction. I'd been working on a series of essays but I think it would work better as a book, probably as like a little memoir. Yeah, I've got a few ideas, but it's just about finding the right project and knowing I can definitely work on it and see it all the way through. Thanks for having me.